and I'll come back to this. I just use it as a placeholder or as a buffer. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I mean by an ecology of games, and this again is looking at sort of the mission I give to students is you have to look at gameplay in a larger context. That it's not just about the title, but it's about the cognitive interaction with the title itself, but also the social and cultural activities that occur around that. And I think I mentioned earlier that I'm very interested in collaborative forms of learning, and this is just a picture, actually my son on the right, and a friend of his. They're playing Spider-Man on the Nintendo DS. But I was just watching them, sort of informally observing them, and how my son sort of came in and sort of actually how to say this in a very literal way. He's sort of taking a more knowledgeable position here. So he's helping his colleague, sort of walking him through the gameplay. How you use the stylus to shoot the web and capture your enemies. And for me, again, this is sort of a nice capture of how gameplay and the way these devices again sort of afford this interaction is quite powerful. And so the ecology here is certainly the device is sort of centering this picture here, but there's interaction going on around that device that are equally important for us. So taking the lead from Salen, Katie Salen works at the Parsons Design School, and she's really one of the forefront of this. And she actually just announced a couple weeks ago, New York City, with Katie Salen as the director, there's a new school called Quest to Learn, and it's a game-based school. And I believe it's middle school through high school, and they're trying to use game-based principles to develop the curriculum from scratch. I wish them the best of luck with this endeavor, but I do think, I'm cautiously optimistic about, here's a huge investment, and actually Microsoft is donating some funds here, and it's going through both the Parsons Design School and the New York University has a new game institute that's being funded through Microsoft. But here's really starting from scratch, building a new curriculum based on principles that are being discussed in G's book and Bolstoff's text and the other things we're talking about in the room here today as well. And so this notion of ecology of game is something that she's coined, that we're looking at game design, game play, how all the various elements from code to rhetoric to social practices and aesthetics cohabit and populate the game world. So again, I appreciate Dr. Ivory sponsoring something like this, because I think this is an instantiation of this notion of ecology of games, that we can look at it from multiple viewpoints, but games are sort of our central focus. And just what she sees as important, and this is me sort of talking about my class a little bit, the themes that we go through in my class. Learning ecologies is pretty much what G is talking about, that learning is not just the manipulation of symbols, but it's participation in a larger group, and that your legitimacy and your place in that group is you demonstrate, not just again regurgitating facts, but actually doing and participating, demonstrating your skill and knowledge within the group. And that's that learning ecology he's talking about. Certainly where Lori had mentioned her interest in perhaps violence or the representation. I mentioned the representation of certain groups in games. Games have certain hidden agenda in terms of sort of how they represent certain demographics, but also, as I mentioned, prior to very, very recently, they were toys built by boys. They were toys built by boys, and so they're for boys, and they didn't sort of exclude other groups. In terms of the second life, the cultural agenda, we're seeing people who are allowed to, take a cultural view of how participation in virtual worlds or gameplay is taking place. Gaming literacies is just how games, using models and simulations, how games promote that type of thinking, systemic thinking or computational thinking. And then design parameters really touches very close to what we do, is, what does it take to either design a game from scratch, or something that I'm doing this semester is taking off-the-shelf titles and looking at how we might insert them into existing curriculum, and how the curriculum does or does not accommodate or appropriate that game title. a little bit of repetition there by that slide. I apologize for that, but this is actually last semester, Marshall. I'm glad you're here because it might look familiar. Last semester we were, and he's gonna be a little bit disappointed because I wanted them to build a game from scratch, and so we had Dr. Young came in, who is a professor in computer science who came from electronic arts, and he taught us some techniques of game developers, and this is one of the techniques is doing a physical model of your game to give perspective and a deeper understanding of what you're trying to do. And Marshall and Rupert and Ryan were the three team members, and I thought they did just a brilliant job of appropriating those design techniques and bringing them into the classroom. And again, I think this speaks to how sort of the multidisciplinary viewpoints here, taking what perhaps, once we had our session today, see how, your program might come into this conversation, and how Dr. Young's work as a designer and computer game designer might come in, how as an education person we come into this environment. So within the ecology of games, the type of questions I'm interested in, and again taking really close to Salen and the folks in the edited version. So what forms of participatory practices do games and gaming engender for youth? So again, what we're seeing as a priority in education, let's say at the forefront, is education has to have a participatory element to it, that we have to find ways for not just students but also folks in the community to participate. So really opening up education. Looking at which forms of learning are present, missing, or reinforced through gaming. And that in some way talks about the hidden agenda that, are we sort of reproducing stereotypes both of ethnicity or gender, but also of just styles of learning. And there's a chapter in the book here that Mimi Ito talks about. There are academic titles, there are entertainment titles, and there are these more constructive titles that do the world building. And so you want to see that, games in and of themselves are not what we're looking for, but sort of games, and bringing our educational objectives and understandings are what we're looking for. And again, this notion of gaming literacies are emerging where, people are talking as, I sort of see myself as a gamer, or I see myself as a Second Life participant in how I conduct myself. This other one I find really interesting, and what we're trying to explore in the classroom is, gaming as a point of entry into a particular knowledge domain, into a particular literacy, or a particular social organization. And again, in education, we're trying to look at these as well. So how a game is a mechanism in a way to enter into these particular communities. And again, there are going to be barriers to them as well. And again, I have a female student who's looking at SPORE, and she was very enthusiastic because she's got a science background and thought, wow, this would be a really cool way to teach science. But as she's played the game, she's found out, her impression is, there are certain elements in there that are just not appealing to a female, and that it doesn't speak to either implicit or explicit ways of knowing and participating that she finds valuable. And I've had to coax her to continue on with the title to complete the assignment, but she's saying, I really don't find this appropriate for, I think, middle school girls to use this title. So it's a very interesting observation from her standpoint. And again, for me, sort of making explicit what an ecology of learning might look like, again, just going into the classroom and seeing how the devices and the media allow for different forms of learning. What's interesting for me in there is that, again, this was not me trying to create some photographable, sort of experience, but you sort of had the range of, there was the individual working by themselves, sort of in a solitary moment. There was a group of girls sitting together, and the device was more of a reference point for conversation, where gameplay was at a minimal. They were really just having the social interaction.